They say the dead don't speak, but sometimes it's their silence that screams the loudest. The house had been empty for 4 months, maybe 5. Nature had already started reclaiming it, vines curling into the porch railings, mildew climbing. The windows like it had something to say. The air was still, thick, like it remembered everything she did not. My name is Mark Joie, and this is Injustice Browin. If this story pulls at you, hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts in the comments. This one cuts deep. Amina stood on the front steps longer than she meant to, like the air itself was asking her if she was sure. The last time she was here, she was 8. Her grandfather, Otis, made her grilled cheese with iron, bread, and hummed old blues songs she didn't know the words to. He barely spoke even back then, not about his life, not about anything that mattered. She stepped inside. The floor groaned like it resented her for leaving so long. Dust hung in the light like slow rain. Everything was still where he left it. The Bible on the nightstand, his boots by the door, the creak in the third step that always made her laugh. Except now, it didn't. She wasn't just here to clean out a house. She came because something about his funeral didn't sit right. No stories, no photos, no past. Just 3 neighbors and a closed casket. Her mother barely spoke. Her aunt just cried. When Amina asked them about Otis's younger years, they shrugged like they were talking about a stranger. She found the journal by accident. The floorboard near the wood stove, lifted just enough to catch her heel. She pulled it up, and there it was, an old leather-bound notebook wrapped in a faded handkerchief, tucked beside a yellowed envelope with her name on it. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled. She opened the journal first. Page after page of empty lines, some filled with single words. August, 1974. Blood, but not mine. I remember the truck. The rest. Blank. Not. Scribbled out. Not torn. Just left untouched. Like he had things to say. But the world made him forget how she kept flipping. Faster now. Desperate for answers. But the more she read, the heavier it felt. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was wounded. Her grandfather had been a janitor. That much she knew. Worked at the same plant for over 40 years. Came home tired. Quiet. He smiled sometimes, but it always felt like a borrowed smile. One that belonged to another life. Amina had always assumed he was just one of those men built more for work than words. But now it felt like maybe he had swallowed a story that no one ever gave him permission to tell. She sat on the floor, dust curling around her knees, journal in her lap, the envelope still untouched. And for a moment, she felt like she wasn't alone in that house. Like his spirit was standing in the corner, watching, waiting to see if she'd open the door. He never could. The wind shifted. It moaned through the cracked walls like it had lungs. And with it came a feeling, not memory, not yet, but a pull, like the past had something left unfinished. That's when she saw it. An old photograph stuck to the inside of the journal's back cover. A boy, maybe 17, standing next to an old truck, dirt on his jeans, light in his eyes. It took her a second to realize it was Otis. He was smiling. Not the tired kind. Not the one she remembered. This one was loud, full, hopeful, and that broke her heart more than anything, because it meant he had it once. Whatever that feeling was, freedom, youth, belief in the future, he had it. And somewhere between that photo and that silence, something took it from him. She looked at the envelope again, still sealed, still waiting. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes, listened to the silence, let it speak, and slowly we began to drift backward. The year is 1965. The air is hotter. The silence is different. And Otis, that same boy, from the photo, he's walking along dirt road with a book in his hand and grease on his shirt. He's still smiling, but not for long. Otis always smelled like oil and sunlight. 17, hands stained black from fixing whatever was broken in town. Lawnmowers, car engines, radios held together with more hope than screws. He never charged much, sometimes nothing at all. He just liked figuring things out. The way metal fit together, how wires hummed when they were finally connected right. Machines made sense. People didn't. He walked 5 miles to school every day, not because it was a workout, because they never paved the road to his side of town. That gravel path, it turned to mud when it rained and a cloud of dust when it didn't. White kids got yellow buses and clean uniforms. Otis got calluses and a pair of hand-me-down shoes that leaned to the left, but he walked with purpose. Always had a book in his hand, sometimes two. Langston Hughes, engineering magazines. Math textbooks borrowed from a teacher who knew he was built for more than that small room. With chipped chalk and crooked desks. That teacher's name was Mr. Bennett. White man, older, different from the rest. He saw Otis sketching carburetors in his notebook and said, "You ever think about college?" Otis just laughed. Nobody in his family had made it past 9th grade, but Bennett wasn't joking. There was a school 2 counties over. Technical college, all white, but progressive, at least on paper. Bennett pulled strings, sent letters, made calls, and by May, Otis had a formal letter in his hands, conditional acceptance to the mechanical engineering prep program, full, tuition covered. He held that envelope like it was gold. He didn't tell many people, just his mama and Mr. Bennett. That night he sat on the porch, grinning in the dark, future rolling out in front of him like a real paved road. But the future doesn't always wait for permission. Sometimes it just stops showing up. It happened weeks later. Otis had just left the school library, had his books, some leftover peach cobbler wrapped in wax paper, and grease still under his nails from fixing Principal Harris's busted truck that morning. He'd never made it home. The police cruiser pulled up slow, real slow, like a shark circling. Something it already knew was bleeding. "Hey, boy, come here." Otis froze. They said there was a robbery down the highway. They said the suspect was a black male, 5'10", dark jeans, suspicious. Otis told them he'd just come from school. He showed them his books, his ID, his clean record, his damn acceptance letter. None of it mattered. They beat him with the butts of their rifles, dragged him behind the squad car, left him in holding, overnight without food, without medical attention. He could barely open his eyes by morning. His ribs screamed when he breathed out by the time they let him go. No charges filed, no explanation. His mother couldn't look at his face without crying. Bennett came by 2 days later, pale and shaking. He said the school had reconsidered their offer, said there was pressure from the board, said the incident made them rethink the optics, said sorry too many times for someone who didn't stop it from happening. That's when Otis learned the truth. Opportunity, when you're black and brilliant, ain't a bridge. It's a rope someone holds just long enough to watch you fall. There was no article in the paper, no apology from the sheriff's office, no protest, no lawsuit, no justice, just silence, heavy, ugly silence. The kind that makes you question if it even happened, if maybe you dreamed it. But the bruises didn't lie. Neither did the crack in his back tooth or the rage swelling in his chest. He never spoke of it. Just went back to fixing things that weren't his, washing clothes that belonged to men who called him boy and laughed while they did it. But something shifted inside Otis after that. The smile in that old photo, it never came back. Not like that. He still walked to town, still helped neighbors, still nodded when white folks passed. But every step, every nod, every time he looked down instead of up, that was a scar. Not on his body, on his future. And he never told Amina, never told anyone. But that silence was never empty. It was full of screams no one ever heard, full of dreams they buried before they bloomed. And now, that silence is cracking, because Amina just found the wound, and she's not the type to leave it alone. The factory floor smelled like heat and metal and tired dreams. Always did. Otis had been sweeping it since the day after his 18th birthday. Same place his daddy worked until the cancer took him. Same break room, same locker, same slow suffocation of being good at everything and still being called boy. He never talked much on the job, just nodded, worked twice as hard, and kept his head down. Not because he lacked pride, but because pride didn't buy groceries when you got fired for looking the wrong man in the eye. He watched the younger white boys come in clueless, asking him how machines worked, pretending to listen. Then months later, those same boys wore clipboards around their necks and shouted across the floor like they ran the world. Otis kept cleaning the same corners, getting the same paycheck. He told himself he didn't mind. He had a wife now, Ruth, sweet, strong, saw through him like glass, and 2 daughters, Lorraine and baby Naomi. They lit up the dark when nothing else could, Naomi especially, sharp as a knife even at 5. She would ask him why his hands were always so rough, why his back hurt, why his boss called him by his first name when everyone else got sir. He'd laugh it off, but inside, it burned. There were days he'd stand in the mop closet, fists clenched, teeth grinding, not because someone had called him a name, but because they didn't even see him. He was invisible until something broke, until the toilets backed up, until someone needed a mess cleaned without making one themselves. And still, he stayed silent. Ruth used to ask him, "How much of yourself are you gonna swallow before there's nothing left to chew?" He'd just say, "I'm feeding this family. That's enough." But it was and single quotes not really, bit by bit. The weight of keeping peace started bending him, not in his spine, in his spirit. He walked a little slower, smiled a little less, laughed like he was borrowing the sound from a better man. Naomi noticed by the time she was 13, she'd started pushing. "Daddy, why you let that man talk to you like that? Why you keep going back there when they treat you like dirt? Why don't you say something?" He never yelled at her, not once, but one night, after his supervisor called him boy, in front of the whole floor for the 5th time that month. He came home and sat at the table longer than usual. Didn't touch his plate. Naomi asked again, and all he said was, "We ain't the kind that get to yell." She stared at him, eyes wide, hurt, confused, like she was seeing him for the first time and didn't know who he was anymore. But Otis believed it with everything in him, because yelling got black men killed in Mississippi. Speaking up meant your house burned, your wife widowed, your daughters crying at a funeral with nobody left to bury. He had seen it, not on TV, in real life, down the road, across the tracks. So no, he didn't yell. He survived, but survival has a cost. Years passed, promotions came and went, never landing on his desk. He trained 3 different supervisors, who ended up making triple his pay. No one said thank you. They just smiled and asked him to show the next guy where the breaker box was at night. He sat on the porch and stared into the dark like he was waiting for it to speak first. And Naomi. She stopped asking. She started yelling for him, in school, at church, at anyone who tried to tell her to stay quiet. Otis would listen through the walls and wonder if maybe he'd built something stronger than he ever dared to be himself. But he never told her that. He just folded his pride, tucked it into his lunchbox, and went back to the factory, because sometimes silence feels like protection, even when it's a prison, even when your children inherit it. And somewhere deep inside him, a voice he'd buried long ago whispered, "If I teach her to be quiet like me, maybe she'll live longer. But what kind of life will it be?" But he didn't say it. He just went to bed, set his alarm, and dreamed of machines that made sense. Amina spoke like someone who never learned to be afraid of her own voice. She wasn't reckless. She was deliberate. She knew how to fold her anger into sentences that cut without bleeding, how to walk into a courtroom full of men who looked nothing like her and still take up space, like she was born for it. Top of her class, interned for 2 judges, could out-argue any man twice her age. Still, none of that stopped them from calling her aggressive instead of assertive. In law school, she was always told she had potential, but potential is a word they use to praise you while keeping the door half shut. She'd raise her hand with a full legal argument and get interrupted halfway through by some boy quoting a textbook she'd already read 3 times. She'd pitch ideas in class groups and watch white classmates repeat them louder like they came up with it first. And the professors, even the black ones, would smile to politely and move on too quickly. She started biting her tongue, so much it felt like part of her diet. But the silence didn't fit her the way it fit Otis. It chafed. So she marched, peacefully, loudly, with purpose. It was supposed to be a quiet protest. Outside a courthouse downtown, signs, chants, speeches, nothing broken, nothing burned. Just tired voices refusing to go unheard again. She was reading from a list of names. Black men shot, beaten, locked up, forgotten, with a line of. Police moved in. She didn't fight, didn't resist. Still ended up on the pavement, hands zip-tied, her cheek pressed to the concrete like it owed her something. Her mother bailed her out that night. Didn't cry, didn't yell, just sat in the passenger seat of the car, silent for 10 minutes before whispering, "You sound just like your grandfather." But louder. That sentence hit harder than the zip ties. Amina didn't know what to do with it. She barely knew the man. He'd been a shadow in her childhood, quiet, kind, but never open. Just a pair of eyes watching from the porch, humming blues songs nobody ever asked him to explain. A week later, he died. Heart failure, they said. She flew down for the funeral, unsure why the grief felt so big for a man she barely knew. The house was smaller than she remembered. It smelled like memory and dust. Everything about it felt like it was waiting. For what? She didn't know, until she found the journal, still half empty, still speaking through the silence. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't before, a sealed envelope, her name written in shaky handwriting that made her throat tighten. She sat on the floor, back against the couch, sunlight cutting across the rug like an old scar. The house felt quieter than it ever had, not just because he was gone, but because something inside him was still trying to speak. She held the envelope for hours before opening it. She thought it might be instructions. It will. Maybe a quote from scripture. It wasn't. It was an apology. The handwriting was rough, the ink smudged in places, like he'd stopped and cried while writing. He didn't say much, just enough to break her. He told her he was proud, that he'd watched her grow from a baby into a storm, that every time she raised her voice, she did what he never could. But he also confessed. He admitted he'd spent his whole life afraid, not just of white folks, but of what they'd do to the people he loved if he made himself too visible. He said he thought silence was safety, but all it ever did was bury the truth deeper. And now, all he could do was hope that the truth, the real truth, didn't die with him. He ended the letter with a single line she would never forget. If my silence was a weight you carried, then your voice is the river that can carry it away. She didn't cry right away. She just sat there, the letter in her lap, the journal beside her, and 1,000 questions she'd never get to ask. But in that moment, Amina understood something she hadn't before. Otis wasn't weak. He was a man born in a world that made silence his only armor. A man who thought shrinking was the only way to keep his children safe. And still, somehow, he had raised a granddaughter who refused to disappear. He built her to be louder than he ever dared to be. And now it was time to speak. It wasn't a long letter. The paper had folds like it had been opened and closed 100 times before it ever reached her. Like maybe he wrote it years ago, but couldn't bring himself to send it. The ink bled slightly at the edges. His handwriting was small, careful, like he was trying not to take up too much space, even here, even now. Amina read the first line out loud, barely above a whisper. To Amina, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Her throat closed, just like that. No warm-up, no warning, just those words and the weight of them. He went on to say he never planned to leave without saying more, but every time he looked at her, he saw someone stronger than he ever was, and somehow that made it harder to admit he'd been afraid. His entire life, he wrote about the road he walked to school, about the letter that promised college, about the night the cops took that future from him. He said the bruises healed, but something deeper didn't. Something inside him stopped trusting the world to give him anything he didn't bleed for. He said he thought silence was strength, that holding it all in, swallowing it down, that's what made a man. That's how you kept your family alive. But then he wrote the line that broke her wide open. Silence is not peace, baby girl. It's just the absence of noise. Peace is when you get to live without hiding who you are. He apologized for not doing more, for not standing taller, for not showing her mother and her aunt and her what a black man could sound like when he didn't flinch. He said he hoped, in some small way, he passed something down anyway, not just his blood, not just his name, but his hope. Then came the last part, the words she'd already memorized from the first time she found the envelope. But that still cracked her heart open when she saw them in his shaky handwriting. If my silence was a weight you carried, then your voice is the river that can carry it away. She didn't cry right away, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was quiet at first, a slow burn. It started in her chest and stretched out like it had been waiting years to take up space. She read the letter again, then again, each time. It felt like her grandfather was sitting right next to her, telling her the things he never could say out loud, telling her that the man she only knew in fragments, the janitor, the quiet one, the man who never raised his voice, had been screaming on the inside all along. She pressed the letter to her chest and finally let the tears come. They weren't loud, they weren't violent, but they were full of everything she never got to ask, everything he never got to say, everything they both carried across the different Americas. When the crying stopped, the quiet came again, but this time it felt different. It didn't press her down. It lifted her. Otis hadn't just passed her a letter. He passed her the story he never got to tell, and now it wasn't just his die, it was hers to die, and stories, real stories, only. Die when no one dares to speak them. She folded the letter with care, slipped it back into the envelope, tucked it into her journal like a second spine. Then she stood up, wiped her face, and made a decision. She wasn't going to carry the silence anymore. She was going to carry the river. The lights weren't too bright. The room wasn't too loud. Everyone sat in polished chairs with name tags and champagne flutes, dressed like they'd already made it. It was the annual Black Excellence Gala at her law school, full of donors, judges, politicians, professors who finally got her name right. Amina stood at the podium. No notes, no slideshow. Just her hands, steady on the wood, her breath calm, her story. At first, she spoke slowly, not to be dramatic, just to make sure no part of it got lost in the quiet. She said her grandfather's name, Otis Elijah Carter. She didn't list his job title. She didn't call him just a janitor. She told them who he was, a boy who walked 5 miles to school because the county wouldn't build a road to black neighborhoods. A young man who got accepted into college, only to have the police beat the future out of him. A father who worked in silence. A man who thought survival meant being small. And then she said this: they told my grandfather that his life didn't belong in a history book, that it wasn't a headline, that it didn't matter. But I'm here to tell you, it did, it does. The room was still. She could feel people leaning forward now. Not for drama, for truth. She told them about the factory, about the insults he swallowed, about the nights he came home with his pride folded into his shirt pocket, about how he tried to protect his daughters by showing them how to keep peace, even if it meant never raising your voice. She paused. Then she told them what he never got to say while he was alive. He wrote me a letter before he died, not filled with wisdom, not dressed in pride, just honesty, raw, trembling honesty. He told me he was afraid most of his life, that he stayed silent not because he didn't care, but because he didn't think this country would let him speak and still survive. A few people closed their eyes, some bowed their heads, but no one looked away. She smiled, faint but sure. I used to think my fire came from nowhere, but I know now, it came from him, from everything he didn't get to say, from every word he buried so that I could dig them back up and speak them for both of us. She took a breath, let the weight sit there a moment. See, the system we live in, it doesn't just punish black resistance, it punishes black stillness too. It made my grandfather choose between pride and a paycheck, between dignity and a daughter's future, and that kind of choice, that's violence too, just slower. Still no clapping, just listening, and she wanted it that way, because some truths deserve silence. She leaned forward slightly, just enough. I don't want your pity. I don't want a scholarship in his name. I want something heavier than that. I want us to stop sanitizing the truth. Stop turning black pain into polished speeches and museum plaques. I want us to remember that history doesn't just happen in Washington or Selma or on the news. It happened in a mock closet, in a silence that lasted too long. Now, someone exhaled out loud, then another. She let the quiet stretch, not for drama, but because that's where the weight was. Then she said the last thing her grandfather wrote. They can bury the man, she read, but not the story. Not if you carry it. A pause, a single breath, and then it came. Not a roar, not fireworks, but a long, rising applause. Not because she performed, but because she told the truth. And sometimes that's all it takes. Afterward, a professor came up to her, the same one who once called her too intense. He shook her hand, didn't say much, didn't need to. Amina walked out into the night. The stars above Atlanta didn't shine brighter just for her, but she looked up anyway, and somewhere inside, she felt it. Not peace, something better, a promise finally kept.